Scroll disclaimer: this story is a fictional dramatization inspired by the legacy and public persona of the legendary actor Vincent Price, known for his iconic roles in horror films. While it draws from real-life elements of his interests and lifestyle, the paranormal events and ghostly encounters described are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual people, events, or locations is purely coincidental and intended for entertainment purposes only. This story is written with deep respect for Vincent Price's contribution to the genre of horror and aims to evoke the same gothic and eerie atmosphere he was famous for. Vincent Price was not an ordinary Hollywood actor. Known for his velvety voice, sinister gaze, and magnetic charm, he carved a niche for himself in horror cinema. But behind the scenes, he was much more than a screen villain. A lover of art, antiquities, and classical architecture, Vincent was drawn to places that had stories, history, and sometimes whispers. It was this fascination that led him to purchase a grand Victorian mansion tucked away in the shadows of the Hollywood Hills in 1959. The mansion had stood vacant for nearly 30 years before he bought it. Locals whispered of strange occurrences, disembodied voices, cold winds in sealed rooms, and lights that flickered for no reason. Some even claimed that previous owners had vanished or left abruptly without explanation. But for Vincent, these stories only added to the mansion's allure. When he first visited the property, accompanied by his art dealer and a real estate agent, he felt an odd stillness in the air. Not silence, stillness, as though the very walls were listening. The house was vast and aged, with tall stained-glass windows, clawfoot bathtubs, and wrought iron balconies. The moment he stepped through the front door, he remarked jokingly, "If ever I were to meet a ghost, I'd want it to be here." No one laughed. They were too unsettled by the sense of invisible eyes tracking their movement. But Vincent grinned with delight. He considered it perfect. Within weeks, he moved in, bringing with him a collection of antique paintings, dusty books, and sculptures from around the world. Many were of Gothic or occult themes. A gargoyle statue from France, a medieval reliquary, and a 17th-century mirror rumored to show the dead to those who dared stare too long. But it was the house itself that intrigued him most. There were rooms that seemed to shift in temperature with no clear source of draft. The main hallway's grandfather clock would ring at odd hours, even when unplugged. And then there were the doors, some that led to nowhere. Behind one, Vincent found only a brick wall. Behind another, an empty, dust-choked room with a broken doll on the floor. But Vincent was never afraid. In fact, he felt an odd sense of belonging. He claimed the spirits, if they existed, welcomed him. He often hosted dinners in the candlelit dining room and recited Edgar Allan Poe aloud to the shadows. Friends thought it was theatrical, just another layer of his love for the macabre. But Vincent often sat alone in the study at night, sipping wine and staring at the fireplace as though someone else were there with him. It wasn't long before the neighbors began to whisper again. They said they saw lights on in every room at midnight, even though Vincent lived alone. A mail carrier claimed he heard an organ playing from inside the house, though Vincent owned no such instrument. A small child from across the street said she waved at a woman in the upstairs window, only to learn later from her mother that no woman lived there. For Vincent, this was just the beginning. He wrote in a letter to a close friend, "This house is alive. I'm sure of it. It sighs at night. It breathes. And sometimes it speaks." He never elaborated on that last line, but he began keeping a private journal, one that he would guard carefully until the day he died. What no one could have predicted, then, was that the man who portrayed horror on screen might soon find himself living inside it. The night Vincent Price officially moved into the mansion, the sky over Los Angeles was unusually dark. A storm had rolled in from the coast, casting thick clouds over the city. Thunder echoed in the hills, and the trees around the property swayed like dancers in a trance. Vincent arrived alone, driving his vintage Rolls-Royce, carrying nothing but a suitcase, his favorite old fountain pen, and a leather-bound notebook he used for writing down odd thoughts and inspirations. The movers had already arranged the essentials, his bed, his desk, a few antiques, but much of the house still sat bare and dust-covered. He insisted on spending his first night alone, claiming it was a kind of ritual. The moment he stepped through the grand doorway, he felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, like walking into a cellar. The thick air held a faint scent of decaying wood and lavender, a strange but not unpleasant mixture. As he walked through the house, every footstep echoed louder than expected, bouncing off the high ceilings and dark wooden floors. The house creaked and moaned, as old homes do, but something about the rhythm of those sounds felt timed, purposeful, almost as if the house was answering his presence. Vincent explored each room methodically, making mental notes. He paused at the central hallway, where a cracked oil painting of a weeping woman hung on the wall. Beneath her eyes, the paint had worn away in streaks, as though she'd truly been crying. He stared at it for a long moment before continuing. When he reached the bedroom upstairs, he found it freezing cold despite the fireplace roaring with fresh logs. The thermometer on the wall read 58 degrees. Still, he chuckled to himself, muttering, they certainly weren't kidding about this place. He placed his journal on the nightstand, lit a few candles for atmosphere, and sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Inside, everything seemed still, until the light from the candle nearest the door flickered violently, casting wild shadows on the walls. He rose to check the window, thinking a draft had gotten in, but it was firmly shut. As he turned back toward the bed, he paused. The candle on the nightstand, the one he hadn't lit, was suddenly burning brightly. Vincent, intrigued rather than frightened, walked over to it. A trick of the mind, he whispered and blew it out. But as he turned around again, he felt it, a sharp, icy breeze passing directly through him. It wasn't the kind of cold that brushes your skin. It pierced. It felt as though something had walked through his very body. The hairs on his arms stood up, and he instinctively stepped back toward the fireplace. Behind him, he heard a faint creak, as if someone were stepping on the floorboards right where he had just stood. He turned sharply. Nothing. No figure. No sign of anyone. But the candle on the nightstand was lit again. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every time Vincent drifted off, he awoke to a new sound. A soft knock on the wall, the slow creak of a door hinge, the unmistakable whisper of footsteps pacing the hallway. Once, he opened his eyes and saw the shadow of someone standing at the foot of his bed. It didn't move. It didn't speak. And when he blinked again, it was gone. Rather than panic, Vincent reached for his notebook and began to write. There is something here, not menacing, curious, perhaps even amused by me. It doesn't want me to leave. It wants me to acknowledge it. He placed the notebook on the table and closed his eyes. By morning, all signs of the disturbances were gone. The temperature had normalized, the candles remained burned out, and the fireplace was cold. But the real shock came when Vincent opened his notebook. Beneath his final line of writing, someone, or something, had added 3 words in elegant, looping handwriting. We see you. He stared at the page in silence. He didn't scream. He didn't flee. Instead, he smiled slowly and whispered to the empty room. Good. I see you too. This was only the beginning. A week had passed since Vincent Price's first night in the mansion, and each evening continued to unravel a fresh layer of its secrets. Though most would have fled after encountering such unsettling phenomena, Vincent was captivated. He treated the house not as a haunted dwelling, but as a living manuscript waiting to be read, the story unfolding one eerie chapter at a time. It was during one of his late-night explorations that he stumbled upon something the real estate agent had never mentioned, a concealed passageway behind a bookshelf in the upstairs hallway. The discovery happened by accident. Vincent was running his fingers along the spines of some antique volumes that had been left behind, most of them unreadable from age or water damage. As he pulled on a particularly large book, the shelf groaned and tilted forward. Dust poured down from the ceiling, and the shelf swung open like a hidden door, revealing a narrow, dark corridor. The air was colder there, sharper, and smelled faintly of mildew and old perfume. At the end of the corridor, Vincent found a heavy door with no visible handle, only a rusted iron ring at its center. With some effort, he pulled it open, revealing what could only be described as a forgotten chamber. The walls were lined with tall, antique mirrors in mismatched frames, some gilded in gold, others blackened with age, cracked at the corners, or coated with dust thick enough to obscure any reflection. In the center of the room stood a single high-backed chair, facing the largest mirror of them all, which nearly reached the ceiling. Around the floor were faint chalk symbols, almost like a ritual circle, though most had been scuffed and partially erased. Vincent stepped inside, a sense of reverence washing over him. He felt like an intruder in a sanctuary of forgotten rituals. He sat in the chair and gazed at the large mirror in front of him. His reflection stared back, tired, curious, and a little pale. But as he tilted his head slightly, he saw a movement not mirrored by his body. A dark figure darted behind him in the glass. Yet when he turned around, the room remained empty. He returned to the mirror slowly. The figure was gone, but the room and the reflection no longer matched reality. The reflection showed an unlit candelabra burning behind him. The chalk symbols were fresh and glowing faintly red. He stood abruptly and turned. Still nothing, but his heart thudded in his chest. Vincent left the mirror room that night with more questions than answers. He sealed the door behind him, but the next morning it was wide open again. Each night that followed, he returned. It became a ritual of its own. The reflections changed frequently, sometimes showing events from earlier in the day, other times revealing details not present in the real world. Once he saw himself asleep in bed, and next to him, a woman sat whispering in his ear. Another time, he saw himself walk into the room, while already standing in it. He began to write obsessively in his journal. The mirrors show something more than reflection. They show memory, possibility, ghosts, or perhaps truth. As the days passed, the experiences intensified. Shadows danced across the walls, even when no light source could cast them. The mirrors fogged over by themselves, and then cleared, revealing unfamiliar faces peering out. Sometimes a handprint would appear on the glass, as though someone pressed against the other side. One night, Vincent brought a Polaroid camera to the mirror room. He snapped photos of each mirror and waited for them to develop. Most came out normal, empty reflections, or just blurred images. But one photo, taken of the large center mirror, showed something chilling. Vincent standing in front of the mirror with a pale woman behind him, her hand on his shoulder. She was not there when he took the photo. He stored the photo in his journal. That night, he dreamed of her for the first time. The woman in black, her face veiled, standing at the foot of his bed. She whispered, not in words, but in feelings, sorrow, waiting, desperation. When he awoke, the photograph was no longer in his journal. Instead, it was pinned to the wall of the mirror room, directly over the chair. From that point forward, the mirror room was no longer just a place of curiosity. It became the central nerve of the haunting. The house didn't simply watch him. It communicated through the mirrors. It showed him what it wanted him to see, sometimes truth, sometimes lies. And Vincent, enthralled and terrified in equal measure, began to wonder, what if the mirrors weren't showing ghosts at all? What if they were revealing fragments of himself he didn't yet understand? Vincent Price had always believed in the beauty of silence, how it framed thought, encouraged introspection, and enhanced the richness of solitude. But in the weeks that followed his encounters in the mirror room, silence became a rare commodity. The mansion, which once stood as a temple of mystery, had begun to breathe with audible life. Its groans were no longer the harmless moans of an old house settling into the earth. They had developed cadence, intention, even language. It began with the walls. At first, it was subtle. Vincent would be reading alone in the study when he'd hear the softest hint of a murmur, like wind rustling through parchment. The sound came from behind the wallpaper, low, muffled voices like someone speaking just out of reach. He pressed his ear to the wall one evening, more amused than frightened, expecting perhaps pipes or the creaking of wood. But what he heard chilled him to his core. His name, whispered, clearly, slowly. Vincent. He pulled back, startled. He paced the room for hours afterward, refusing to believe what he'd heard. But denial became impossible when the whispers followed him from room to room. Sometimes it was incoherent muttering. Other times it was laughter. Once, in the middle of the night, it was a scream, so sudden and piercing that he bolted from his bed, convinced someone had broken in. Yet every door remained locked, every window untouched. He began hearing footsteps above him when he knew no one was upstairs. The sounds weren't random. They had rhythm, like someone pacing back and forth with intention. On one particularly quiet evening, while enjoying a glass of wine by the fireplace, he heard footsteps walk the entire length of the hallway behind him, stop at the study door, and knock. Just once. Firm. Hollow. Measured. He opened the door immediately. No one was there, but the candle on the hallway table had been lit. One of the most disturbing incidents happened during a call with a director friend. Vincent was seated in the music room, discussing an upcoming project, when he heard a faint whisper rise beneath the floorboards. It grew louder and louder until the line on the other end of the phone went silent. Then the whisper came through the phone itself. "Why do you stay?" it asked, in a voice not of this world. His friend never called back. Vincent began documenting every sound, every word, every movement. He left his journal open at all times, sometimes finding entries he didn't recall writing. Entire pages would appear overnight, describing dreams he didn't remember having, detailing encounters he wasn't sure were real. He even recorded audio on a small reel-to-reel tape recorder. The playback always had strange distortions, echoes of voices overlapping his own, quiet breathing where there should have been none. The whispers were not limited to walls and floors. They began to seep into his dreams. The woman from the mirror returned, now more vivid, more tangible. She would stand at the end of long hallways, always facing away. When he called to her, she would vanish. In one dream, she finally turned. Her face was pale, with hollow eyes that held no emotion, only a deep, endless sorrow. When she spoke, her lips didn't move, but Vincent heard the words clearly in his mind. "You live in our story now." One morning, Vincent awoke to find writing scrawled across his mirror in the bathroom. Not written in lipstick or soot, but seemingly etched into the condensation itself. Listen closer. That day, he did something he hadn't done in years. He visited a Catholic church in downtown Los Angeles. Not to pray, just to be somewhere that felt untouched. The moment he stepped inside, he broke into a cold sweat. The priest noticed and asked if he was all right. Vincent replied with a faint smile, "I just needed to hear a different kind of silence." When he returned home, the whispers had grown bolder. He could hear multiple voices now, layered and shifting, male, female, young, old. Some spoke English, others something older, harsher, broken. They no longer only whispered. They argued. They laughed. They wept. And they seemed to know everything about him, his thoughts, his regrets, his fears. They would mention things no one else could know. His mother's lullaby, a childhood nightmare, the poem he once wrote but never shared with anyone. But the most terrifying moment came one night when he heard his own voice echo back from the walls, repeating a line he had said hours earlier, "I am not afraid of you." Except when the voice repeated it, it laughed afterward. That was the night Vincent began sleeping in the mirror room. He felt oddly safe there, surrounded by reflections, by illusions. There, the voices were quiet, perhaps because the house had already claimed that room, or because something older resided within it. And as the walls continued to whisper, Vincent began whispering back. Despite the mansion's increasingly sinister atmosphere, Vincent Price never isolated himself completely. In fact, he began inviting old friends from the industry to visit, fellow actors, directors, and close acquaintances who shared his love of the Gothic and the peculiar. Most believe his stories were playful exaggerations, part of his theatrical charm. But Vincent wanted them to see for themselves. He wanted validation. Or perhaps he wanted someone else to share the weight of what the house was becoming. His first guest was Peter Lorre, the eccentric actor known for his unsettling screen presence and keen sensitivity to energy. Vincent welcomed him with warmth and vintage red wine, giving him the grand tour by candlelight. Lorre was amused at first, making snide remarks about staged ghost theatrics. But his tone changed when they reached the upstairs hallway. He stopped mid-sentence, visibly disturbed. "Do you hear that?" he asked, voice suddenly serious. Vincent listened, silence. "Hear what, Peter?" Laurie tilted his head. A woman crying, very faint, from behind the walls. They never found the source. That night, Laurie refused to sleep in the guest room and instead dozed off in an armchair in the study with the lights on. The next morning, he left without breakfast, muttering, "Something in that house watches, but it doesn't blink." Next came a more elaborate gathering. Vincent hosted a small dinner party for 4 well-known names in the horror circuit, including Christopher Lee and a curious young writer named Richard Matheson. Wine flowed freely, and the conversation drifted toward the supernatural. As a joke, they decided to visit the infamous mirror room. Christopher Lee, tall and unshakably dignified, entered first. He stood silently before the central mirror while the others watched. After a few seconds, he said, "Someone's behind me." They looked. No one was there. "I'm not joking," he added, stepping aside quickly. "There was someone, a woman, just behind my shoulder." Her face was wrong. The group laughed nervously, assuming it was part of Vincent's elaborate scare tactics. But their nerves began to fray when one of them, a producer known for debunking ghost stories, claimed to feel physically pushed while near the back corner of the room. He stumbled and knocked over a candelabra, which extinguished every flame in the room at once. The mirror room plunged into darkness. For a few tense seconds, no one moved. Then a low whisper filled the air. "You brought them to feed us." Richard Matheson later described the sound as a voice spoken from beneath the earth. The guests left shortly afterward, visibly shaken. None of them spoke about the visit publicly, and 2 never returned any of Vincent's calls. But perhaps the most disturbing event occurred when Bela Lugosi, the famed Dracula actor, agreed to stay overnight in the mansion. The 2 men spent the evening reminiscing about their careers, their love of the macabre, and the strange sensation that horror films never captured true fear, only glimpses of it. That night, Lugosi was given the East Wing guest room. At 3:13 a.m., Vincent was awoken by screams. Lugosi's voice, deep and terrified. He rushed to the guest room to find Bella collapsed on the floor, pale and shaking, muttering in Hungarian. When he calmed, he refused to say what he'd seen, only that they touched my mind, not just my skin. He left the next morning without packing his belongings. Weeks later, Vincent received a telegram that read simply, "Burn that room." Vincent didn't. He couldn't. Something wouldn't let him. From then on, no one stayed the night. Even those who still visited insisted on leaving before dark. One director joked that the house made his teeth itch, and a cinematographer claimed every photo taken inside came out distorted. Faces warped, rooms stretched, and mirrors always showing more than one reflection. Vincent, now more curious than ever, continued to record everything. He began noticing patterns. Most guests experienced the haunting more severely than he did. Was the house jealous? Possessive? Or was it merely trying to isolate him? Make him its own? He wrote in his journal, "It tests them, measures their fear, but spares me for now. I become part of its cast. A character in a production older than time." By now, the whispers in the walls no longer tried to hide. They murmured through dinner, echoed during baths, sometimes even joined him in laughter. The shadows in the mirror no longer ran. They watched, waiting for something. And Vincent Price began to feel a strange shift inside himself. The fear had dulled. In its place was an unspoken pact between actor and house. He would stay, and it would continue the performance. By the time autumn crept into the Hollywood Hills, Vincent Price had lived in the mansion for several months. And with each passing week, the supernatural presence around him had grown more organized. No longer random or fleeting, the encounters now felt deliberate, calculated, as if the spirits had begun rehearsing a play, and Vincent had been cast in a lead role without his consent. The whispers spoke more clearly, the shadows moved with awareness, and the mirror room pulses with an energy that clung to him long after he left it. One morning, while reading from his leather-bound journal, Vincent came across a peculiar note he didn't remember writing. "They want to be named." The words were written in a thick, unfamiliar script, shaky but forceful, and smeared slightly, as if the ink had bled from a trembling hand. The idea burrowed into his thoughts. If the spirits in the house truly had voices and memories, perhaps naming them, acknowledging them, was the key to understanding their purpose. That's when he decided to hold a seance. He contacted Madame Lyra, an elusive spiritualist who had conducted private seances for several of Hollywood's elite. She was known for her ability to summon intelligent spirits and had a reputation for leaving even skeptics pale with disbelief. When Vincent called her, she said only, "I've been expecting this," and agreed to arrive the following Friday at dusk. The night of the seance was clear and cool. A full moon hung over the city like a watching eye. Vincent prepared the dining hall meticulously, closing the velvet curtains, lighting tall candelabras, and arranging a round table at the center of the room. He invited no one else. This ritual was not for entertainment, he told himself. It was for truth. Madame Lyra arrived dressed in flowing black garments, her eyes lined with thick kohl, her presence commanding and strangely calm. She surveyed the mansion with a subtle nod, as if confirming suspicions long held. "This house is not simply haunted," she said quietly. "It's inhabited." As they sat across from each other at the round table, Madame Lyra placed a small crystal orb between them and lit 4 black candles at each compass point. She instructed Vincent not to speak unless addressed by a spirit, and to keep his hands flat on the table at all times. The seance began with a deep humming chant in an ancient language. The temperature dropped immediately. The flames on the candles flickered violently, though no draft could be felt. Then Madame Lyra's eyes rolled back, and her body went unnaturally still. Moments later, she spoke in a voice not her own. It was higher, feminine, and filled with a weeping tone. "She is waiting. She watches from the glass." Vincent leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Who is she?" he whispered. The voice answered with a name, Isadora. Then the medium's voice shifted again, deeper now, masculine coarse. "He made the deal. Bound us all. Blood for legacy. Fame for chains." "What deal?" Vincent asked. "Who made it?" The table began to shake. The orb in the center fogged over with a misty gray swirl, and Madame Lyra let out a pained cry. The spirits were fighting to speak at once, overlapping voices clashing in the air. He summoned the mirrors. He promised not again. Then, in the chaos, a loud crash rang out. The massive chandelier above the dining table snapped loose from its chain and fell, smashing into the table with violent force. The candles blew out. Glass shattered everywhere. The seance was broken. In the suffocating silence that followed, Madame Lyra collapsed forward. Vincent pulled her upright, shaken but unharmed. Her voice, hoarse and barely audible, rasped, "They know you're listening now." That's what they wanted. Vincent tried to process the fragments of what he'd heard. A woman named Isadora. A pact made by someone before him, perhaps a previous owner. A bargain involving blood and fame. And a warning, not again. He walked Madame Lyra to her car, but before she left, she placed something in his hand, a tarnished silver key with strange markings. "You'll know when to use it," she said. "But be careful. Some doors don't open to let you in. They open to let something out." That night, Vincent didn't sleep. He sat in the mirror room, the silver key in his hand, staring into the largest mirror. And for the first time, he didn't see a reflection. He saw a door. Vincent Price sat in silence long after the seance, staring into the grand mirror in the secret chamber. The room was completely still, yet something inside him had shifted. He clutched the silver key Madame Lyra had given him, his fingers tracing its strange etchings again and again. The seance had left him with more questions than answers, but one thing was now certain. The spirits in this house were not random hauntings. They were connected by a purpose, and that purpose had something to do with him. The next morning, Vincent set out to uncover the truth about the mansion's previous owners. He visited the county records office, the historical society, and even reached out to a professor of occult literature he once collaborated with on a film script. After days of research, a name emerged again and again. Emery Thorne, the mansion's original owner. A theater magnate, Thorne had mysteriously vanished in 1891, shortly after the construction of the house. No body was ever found. Rumors hinted at occult practices and secret gatherings, rituals said to promise artistic immortality. Vincent's curiosity deepened. He began scouring the mansion from top to bottom, looking for anything Thorne may have left behind. It was in the attic, behind a rotting armoire and beneath warped floorboards, that he discovered a hidden compartment. Inside it was a decaying wooden box, wrapped in waxy cloth, tied shut with blackened twine. He took it downstairs and opened it carefully. Inside was a fragile, curled document. A contract written in old, elaborate script, sealed with a red wax insignia that had long since cracked. The paper was stained, possibly with age or blood. The language was formal, riddled with archaic terms, but Vincent could decipher the essentials. I, Emery Thorne, do swear by ink and life to surrender soul and shadow to the watchers of the mirror in exchange for everlasting renown in the halls of man's remembrance. My story will be told forever. Let it be known that in the seventh cycle, the vessel shall be passed on to the willing host, who enters the mirror freely. It was a pact, a deal made not with the devil, but with entities that live beyond the mirror, spirits bound to art, memory, and ego. In exchange for fame and legacy, Thorne had surrendered himself to them. And now, according to the document, that burden was to be passed on. Vincent read the final clause aloud. He who does not break the mirror becomes it. Suddenly, the room grew icy. The fireplace extinguished without wind. The candle flames flickered and then stretched unnaturally high, like arms reaching. And from the walls, the whispers rose again, now clearer than ever before. The curtain never falls. You know your lines? Your audience is eternal. Vincent stumbled backward, contract in hand. He rushed to the mirror room, heart racing, breath short. When he entered, he saw his reflection waiting, already standing in the center of the room. It smiled. The mirror didn't show him. It showed a version of him, one that seemed more confident, more theatrical. It blinked when he didn't. Its eyes sparkled with something alien. It pointed down, toward the floor at the foot of the chair. There, dusted in ash and time, lay a small hollow. Vincent reached in and found a black leather-bound book. Inside, he discovered dozens of signatures, each written in different ink from different centuries. Emery Thorne's name was there. Others he didn't recognize, faint names now lost to history. But one space at the bottom was blank. Beside the signature line, in crisp handwriting, was a short instruction: write with your own ink. Only then shall you belong. Vincent looked back into the mirror. The reflection was still smiling, but now tears ran down its face. He felt a cold pressure on his shoulder, like a hand, gentle but firm. In his journal that night, he wrote, "The house doesn't trap ghosts. It collects stories. The mirrors hold memories of those who made the pact. They perform forever, watched by things beyond comprehension." But the question that haunted him most was not what the contract meant, but whether he'd already signed it, without ink, without ceremony, simply by living here, recording, watching, staying. He set the contract on his writing desk. By morning, the paper was gone. In its place sat his own journal, now sealed with red wax, and his name was etched on the cover. Vincent Price had once been a man of theatrical flair, a lover of scripts, roles, and camera lights. But in the final chapter of his life inside the mansion, he no longer needed a stage. The house had become one. Every hallway, every mirror, every whisper in the dark was part of a performance he hadn't realized he'd auditioned for. And now, he was no longer merely acting in a story. He was the story. After the contract disappeared and his name appeared etched into his own journal, something in the house shifted. The manifestations became calmer, more frequent, and more deliberate. The spirits no longer tried to scare him. Instead, they seemed to regard him as a partner, an accepted cast member in their endless play. The mirror room was now his sanctuary. Every evening, just after midnight, he would sit in the high-backed chair and speak aloud to his reflection, not as a madman, not as a frightened tenant, but as a host. He would recount memories from his life, tales from old film sets, lost loves, regrets that gnawed at him quietly for decades. And the mirror always listened. Sometimes it responded. One night, he told the mirror about a woman he'd loved in his youth, someone forgotten by Hollywood, but never by him. As he spoke, the fog on the mirror's surface cleared, and he saw her face appear behind his own. She looked just as she had in 1947, wearing that same blue dress, her lips trembling in a silent smile. Vincent wept openly, whispering, "I never got to say goodbye." The mirror woman placed her hand against the glass. For a moment, so did he. Their palms aligned, and for the briefest second, it felt like she was really there. From then on, the ghost began to show him scenes, memories, maybe not always his own. Children playing in the upstairs hall, a woman singing lullabies in French, Emery Thorne writing feverishly by candlelight. Vincent understood. These spirits weren't prisoners. They were stories with no audience, and he had become their only listener. He continued to host friends occasionally, always warning them, always explaining what they might encounter. But most never returned. Some cried in the mirror room. Others couldn't even step through its threshold. The house, it seemed, only welcomed those willing to see with more than their eyes. Over time, Vincent aged. He moved more slowly, his voice deeper, raspier, yet still full of that elegant weight. But his mind remained sharp. He wrote until the very end, pages and pages of reflections, stories, confessions. He called them scripts of the forgotten. No one ever saw those pages. They vanished the night he died. It was a stormy October evening when the butler, one of the only staff members who stayed, found him in the mirror room, sitting upright in the chair, eyes closed, a small smile on his face. The mirrors around him were still. No folk, no sado, just Vincent finally still. A single candle had burned low beside him, the wax dripping onto the floor in the shape of a spiral. The coroner ruled it natural causes. No foul play. But those who knew him, those who'd seen the house, knew better. In the weeks after his death, the mansion was placed under private lock, never resold. It was said to be cursed, of course, but not in the traditional sense. No one who entered was harmed. But each visitor described a strange sensation, that someone was watching, not with menace, but with expectation, like an audience waiting for a show to begin. They say if you visit the mansion at midnight and step into the mirror room, you can still see him, Vincent Price, sitting in the chair, his reflection smiling at you even when you don't smile back. He may whisper a line from one of his films, or something more personal, something only you would know. And if you answer, if you engage, he'll nod once, and the other spirits will gather. Because to them, you're no longer just a visitor. You are the next chapter. 58.